Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Alluxio's monthly webinar. My name is Amelia, and I will be your host and moderator today. Before I introduce our speaker, I just have a few housekeeping items. Today's session is recorded and will be available for on-demand playback. Throughout the presentation, you're welcome to ask questions at any time, and you can do so by submitting your questions in the Q&A box located in your Zoom webinar panel. You do not have to wait to the end of the presentation to ask your questions. That's it for housekeeping. I'm pleased to introduce Adit Madan, who is our Director of Product Management at Alluxio. Adit is also the core maintainer and project management committee member of the Alluxio open source project. Adit has extensive experience in distributed systems and large-scale data analytics. In today's session, Adit will be diving into the latest and greatest in the newest release of Alluxio, Alluxio 2.9. Without further ado, passing it on to you, Adit.
Thanks, Amelia. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today, like Amelia said, I'm going to give you guys an overview of the latest product release and highlight a few of the features which were included in the current release. So before I do that, just setting some context on the product and the scenarios that we get used in. I'll use these three things that you see on screen as a way of setting the context for scenarios, describing scenarios why these features were developed. So the first one, as you all who might be familiar with Alluxio know, is Alluxio is used in scenarios where you're accessing data across silos, and these silos could be distributed across regions or clouds. And the second scenario, which is common for a lot of our customers, is the need for application portability. And by this, what I mean is a certain profile of customers that we work with, they are operating across multiple different environments, whether on-premises data centers and public clouds. Oftentimes, there is a need to be portable in terms of the applications that they're running, so that they can run across any of these environments without extensive rework. And the last one is about, excuse me, and the last one is about operating a multi-tenant environment, and I'll define what I mean by multi-tenancy in just a few slides. So in this particular release, we have certain developments which is focused on the first aspect as well, making data access across regions more efficient. We have certain developments around the portability and also the multi-tenancy aspect. Again, this is just setting the context again. You would remember that we have the Alluxio distributed system, which is a platform which sits between different compute engines and different storage types. So in this particular presentation, when I'm going to use the term data API, what I'm really referencing to is this row over here, where you have Alluxio speaking different languages to compute engines and applications on top. Particularly, we are going to talk a little bit more about this box right here, where it says the S3 interface on top. This has seen some significant development in Alluxio in the last few releases, and this particular release is no different. So when I talk about S3 interface, I'm really highlighting the application portability need on top. So not just the S3 interface, but other interfaces that we provide. One of the benefits of that is, regardless of the storage system that you see on the bottom, you can use a common interface across heterogeneous storage systems. Now, the second aspect, like I said, where I'll focus a little bit on as well, is the data caching aspect of Alluxio. So in the middle, where you see Alluxio in blue, one of the things that the Alluxio platform does is provide a highly distributed cache across remote data sources. And we'll talk about how that is becoming more efficient, the IO path, including the data cache. This particular release, we are not going to talk heavily about data tiering. Data tiering in general includes the caching capabilities, but also storage tiering across multiple different kinds of hot or cold storage systems that you may be operating on. This is another way of cost saving, but this particular 2.9 release is not going to highlight anything around the data tiering capabilities. So the focus will be on the data API and also the data cache. So we work with different profiles, and you might find yourself in an environment which may look something like this. The general theme for this current release is keeping this profile of customers in mind, in which it's not uncommon to operate with multiple different environments. And when I say environment, what I really mean is one on-premises data center is one environment, one cloud region is one environment, and similarly another cloud provider or a cloud region is another environment. So each of these boxes that you see in the screen, when I use the term environment, I'm referencing to any one of these boxes. Now, with Alluxio, like I said, it's not uncommon to have multiple instances of Alluxio, and a lot of the development that I'm going to highlight, which is included in the 2.9 release, is keeping this in mind, that for any large scale enterprise, you would end up operating multiple instances of Alluxio, often spread across environments. Okay, so that gets me to what's new in the latest release. I'm excited to share 5 highlights from the latest release, and the first one is about a multi-tenant or a multi-environment scenarios, very similar to the picture that I shared on the last slide. So we're introducing something called cross-cluster synchronization. I'll describe scenarios where that is applicable in and how that works in just a second. But the exciting thing here is that it's the first time that multiple clusters of Alluxio are now aware of each other. The second one is about resource efficiency. And when I say resource, I'm including all kinds of resources, including the storage that Alluxio uses for caching. And there's been a change in which we are introducing a capability right now, not GA, it's in preview state, in which we are changing the way we represent data on the Alluxio workers for caching. And I'll share reasons and scenarios where this would be useful. And the third highlight of this release is about the security aspect of using our northbound S3 API. And this plays a major role in application portability, especially for applications which do not use our Java clients, things like Python applications and other applications that you may be onboarding to your platform. The S3 API is highly useful for that. And again, last but not the least, on the operations side, we're introducing a couple of neat features in Alluxio. One is a Kubernetes operator, and then we have certain insights that we're providing for general system health, which should help the management cost of Alluxio, especially when a customer is operating dozens of other Alluxio clusters. Great. So that gets me to the first of the 5 highlights. The first feature that I'm highlighting is what we call cross-cluster synchronization. And a cluster here means an Alluxio cluster. So there are 2 general scenarios where this is applicable for, and I'm describing the first one on this slide. The first one is, if you recall the picture I had from a few slides back, it had 4 different environments which were represented by 4 different boxes, 2 in different clouds and 2 in different data centers. So this is what any one of those environments could look like. So even within a single environment, there are scenarios which would benefit from having multiple Alluxio clusters, and each Alluxio cluster overlapping to some extent on the data sets that they may be accessing. So when I say tenant here, it's really referencing to team level tenants, not individual level tenants. So this is proposing an architecture which is being adopted by some of our customers and is increasingly picking up, in which we see the desire to have multiple Alluxio clusters, each dedicated to a team level tenant, so that each team is isolated from another team, which may be consuming data from the same data lake storage. Again, this data lake storage could be all in the cloud, or it could be on premises as well. So even in cloud storage, we've seen scenarios with customers where at scale, they're hitting storage limits for cloud storage like ADLS or even Amazon S3. So for these scenarios, if multiple tenants are accessing the same storage, they're clearly not isolated from each other. As for example, if one team is responsible for an operational cluster, but I have multiple analytics consumers, the analytics consumption may interfere with the operational workloads as well. So one way to isolate tenants from each other is to have what we call satellite Alluxio clusters, each tenant having their own instance of Alluxio, which is a logical cluster, and it isolates tenants from each other. Now, the natural question that may come to mind is that Alluxio does maintain a copy of the metadata which is being accessed by each tenant. So there is an aspect of Alluxio having to maintain the consistency of this metadata, and especially once you are operating multiple clusters of Alluxio with overlapping namespaces, there is overlapping metadata across these different instances of Alluxio. So this new feature that we're introducing, like I said, it's the first time multiple instances of Alluxio are aware of each other. So in case updates are originating in one tenant, that tenant is able to push these event updates to maintain a consistent view of data across different Alluxio clusters as well. So if tenant 1 was writing data which is going to be consumed by tenant 2 and tenant 3, by this federation of Alluxio clusters that we have with this new feature, it's done in near real time, and these events are pushed instead of tenant 2 and tenant 3 having to poll the underlying data lake storage and discover what has been changed by tenant 1. So if you take a step back and look at the impact of this architecture, generally you can see that each box here is representing a module which can be added without impact on the previous module. So this allows organizations agility to onboard new application teams without impacting existing workloads. So another scenario in which this feature is being evaluated and soon adopted by customers is what I show on the screen. So like I said, I'm very excited about this new capabilities in which we are able to scale the metadata consistency beyond what we were capable of before. So what this scenario is showcasing is there is a data lake storage, and in this scenario, environment 1 is accessing a data lake storage which resides in environment 2. But like if you remember, I highlighted in the beginning of the presentation the need for application portability. And this portability, one of the scenarios where this comes in is, for example, if you are looking to burst your compute from one environment to a second environment. Now, without moving the data itself. So when you want to burst from one environment to a second environment or add additional workloads in, let's say, environment 2, when you were running originally in environment 1, with Alluxio, you will need to keep a consistent metadata across these environments. And that's where, again, this cross-cluster synchronization comes in to provide a uniform view for an elastic platform across different environments. Now, the way to get started with this feature is included in the Enterprise Edition for 2.9. And the scenario for this, just taking an example of a 2-cluster scenario, again, we have customers evaluating this feature, this new feature for multi-cluster scenarios in which the cluster count is much higher than 2. But just looking at the example for 2, how the configuration would look like for 2 clusters, the first step, the first major change in this release is that there is an additional process which is included for this new feature. This process is called a cross-cluster master, and this can reside in a stateless pod in Kubernetes as well. And the purpose of this new process is to maintain metadata such as the cluster membership. So when the membership of clusters is dynamic, such as you spin Alluxio clusters up or down, this process, which is stateless, keeps track of which clusters are actively part of our members or of the cross-cluster quorum. Now, cluster 1 and cluster 2 are just 2 clusters who are members, and you can see the configuration for each of these clusters. They are pointing, they each have a unique ID, and they're pointing to a particular mount point, which requires this cross-cluster synchronization. So what this means is that if there is an update on cluster 1, to this mount point, which we see on screen, the events for those updates will be asynchronously passed on to cluster 2, so that cluster 2 can maintain its metadata in sync with what the updates were, with the updates that originated on a separate Alluxio cluster. Okay, so moving on, I'm on the second of the 5 highlights of this new release, and this highlight is called paging storage. Like I said, the purpose of this is to improve the data I/O efficiency when Alluxio is accessing a remote storage system. So the change is on an Alluxio worker, the way that we represent the storage or how we chunk up files into blocks previously, and now we chunk them up into a finer granularity called paging. So the size of paging is much smaller than what we're used to with a block. For example, if we access a 1 gigabyte file or a 500 megabyte file, and we only end up reading certain columns of those files, we would end up caching on the boundary of blocks before. So the smallest unit that would be cached before the 2.9 release and without using this feature called paging storage would be typically would be in the 32 megabytes to a 64 megabytes range. So that would be the smallest chunk of data. So even if you end up reading only let's say 4 megabytes, you would still end up caching 32 megabytes. Now, with this new feature, which we're calling paging storage, the granularity of caching is much smaller. So what this means is that for storage that is configured on the Alluxio workers, with this feature enabled, we would be a lot more efficient in terms of the amount of data, the amount of storage that we need on an Alluxio worker. So just based on our experience, the amount of amplification prior to this feature can be as high as 3x. So what this means is if your queries are accessing data which is 100 megabytes from a 1 gigabyte data set, we might end up caching, we might end up needing 300 megabytes for caching. And generally the cost is lower as you as the amount of queries increases. But with this release, even for a small set of queries, what we're saying is that the amplification factor will go down from 3x to about 1.3x with paging. Cool. The next update that we have is around our northbound S3 API. And for those of you keeping track, you've seen development on our S3 API in the past few releases as well. It's becoming an increasingly popular way of accessing Alluxio for applications who don't have access to the Java SDK, but also even for applications which have the Java SDK, having a stable stateless interface, which does not need upgrades when you upgrade the version of Alluxio, has a lower management cost. So this is something that is actively being evaluated and adopted across different kinds of applications. So with this release, the highlight is on the security aspect when you're using our northbound S3 API as the way to access data from your different data sources. Now, with this release, there are two aspects that I'm highlighting of the S3 API. One is the authentication mechanism, and then how it ties in to the authorization mechanism as well. Now, with this release, we are introducing authentication using an OpenID protocol. So we hook into systems like Ping Federate so that the authentication for S3 requests to Alluxio can be done using an ID provider such as Ping Identity. Now, at the same time, we also hook into open policy agents such as Apache Ranger, and also something called open policy agent, which is more prevalent in the Kubernetes world. So the OPA provides a flexible way of enforcing policies, including policies which can be based on user and resource attributes. So this is something we are using Ping Federate and the combination of OPA as the way to enforce, as one of the ways to enforce authorization and authentication for our northbound S3 API. So with this, you can expect to use the northbound S3 interface across environments. So not just for Amazon S3, but also different kinds of data sources like ADLS or GCS, or even your on-prem S3 object stores. Okay, so the next highlight I have is around the operations front. And on the operations side, we are introducing a new Kubernetes operator, and especially keeping in mind scenarios where customers might be operating multiple instances of Alluxio, maybe inside dedicated namespaces for different tenants. Now, the Kubernetes operator, you guys must be familiar with how the Kubernetes operators work in general. We have these custom resource definitions, which is a declarative way of specifying the desired cluster state. And then the operator works to ensure that the cluster state matches the desired Alluxio cluster state as well. So with the new operator, we are in phase one of the operator, in which we've achieved parity with the Alluxio Helm charts, and it also includes additional logging for resource consumption across the multiple instances of Alluxio that you might be operating in your environment. More advanced features for the Kubernetes operator are planned for future releases, and I'm happy to receive your feedback once you guys are able to try out what we are providing in the current release. So this is something that we should expect for the development in upcoming releases as well. So the final feature to highlight in this release is a nifty little feature, but it should be highly useful based on the feedback that we've received. And it's a new metric that we call master system status. As you guys know, the Alluxio master is a very critical component of Alluxio, and one of the things that is often a concern is when I'm scaling my platform, how do I know that as I add more workloads to the platform, do I need to upgrade my hardware to get better resources? Do I need to size my cluster up? And do I, in general, need to change the state of the cluster? So one of the things that we're introducing in this release, like I said, is this new metric called master system status. And what it does is it infers the overall state of the system by inspecting a combination of different resource usage, including CPU and memory, and also some critical internal data structures. So by resource usage, you could think of things like the JVM heap and the garbage collection time, and also internal data structures such as log tables, to see what is the general health of Alluxio. So this metric is a good indication of if you've put all of a sudden a lot more load on the Alluxio system, if something needs to change, inspecting this new metric should point you in the right direction. So the possible statuses for this metric are what you see on screen. If there's no workload, no heavy load on the system, the metric will display idle. Otherwise, you could expect it to go all the way from idle to active to stress to overloaded, which means it's been under sustained stress over a period of time, and something needs to change. So that kind of gets me to the summary for the release. I hope you guys enjoyed the 5 features that I shared, and I'm looking forward to feedback from all of you when you start using them. So the 5 things that I highlighted for this particular release, the general theme, as you would recognize, is the general theme is to enable agility for a platform as new tenants are onboarded, but also reduce the people and the infrastructure cost for managing a large scale infrastructure. So with what we've showed, it's reducing the cost of using multiple instances of Alluxio across environments, and the tooling that we showcased for operations, but also the efficiency improvements that we showcased with the paging worker storage and IO optimizations is further driving down the cost of such an infrastructure as well. That's the end of my presentation. In case you have more questions, we are happy to connect on our Slack channel. We will share the recording and these slides out with these links. If you're interested in learning more, we have a blog which talks about similar things as we discussed in the presentation today. But also we have more detailed release notes, both for the Alluxio Community Edition, which is based on our open source and is free to use, and also our Enterprise Edition separately, which includes highlights from both the Enterprise and the Community Edition. Both versions of the product are available for download immediately. Alluxio Community Edition is free, and trials of the Enterprise Edition can also be downloaded from the link that you see on screen. I'm happy to take any questions if there are.
Thank you, Adit. Thank you for the fascinating inside look into the latest in 2.9. We do have a couple of questions here, and encourage folks to feel free to submit, whether it's through the Q&A box in the Zoom webinar or directly messaging me. So the first question we have here is, going back to the cross-cluster sync feature, how are failure scenarios handled?
That's a great question, Amelia. So in the cross-cluster sync scenario, the design of the feature is fairly simple, which accommodates different kinds of failures. And these failures can include scenarios in which you are restarting an Alluxio cluster for maintenance, and also for multi-environment scenarios in which you have network outages possibly between two different regions or two different environments. So in each of these scenarios, what cross-cluster sync introduces is the ability to invalidate a certain section of the Alluxio namespaces. So in case there is an outage, it signals that a certain section of the Alluxio namespace might be out of sync and it needs to be synced. So for the period of the interruption, we will maintain consistency transparently without manual intervention again.
And a follow-up to that question is, does cross-cluster sync affect the write performance?
No, the short answer is no. So if in the scenario that I was describing before, when you have two clusters, let's say cluster one is the data producer, it's writing to a certain section of the namespace, and cluster 2 and cluster 3 are consumers. Cluster 1 does not wait for writes to be propagated to cluster 2 and cluster 3 before acknowledging the client. So the performance of write operations on cluster 1 are not impacted by this synchronization capabilities. So cluster 1 would still acknowledge the client as soon as the write completes only on cluster 1.
Got it. And just out of my curiosity, of all of the features, whether in Community or Enterprise Edition, which one would you say is your favorite or the one that you're most excited about?
That's a hard question to answer because I love all of my engineering team equally. If I had to pick one, I would pick the cross-cluster synchronization feature. Like I said, it's the first time multiple clusters of Alluxio are aware of each other, and there's a lot more potential that we can realize with this awareness across these multiple instances of Alluxio.
And that feature is in the Enterprise Edition?
Correct.
Okay, great. Here we have another question, which is, what is the benefit of using OPA? I think you might have touched on it, but if you could elaborate.
Yeah, so OPA is it's a flexible way of authorization, not just for components in the big data ecosystem. So not only for Spark or Trino or Presto workloads, but also it's something that can be used across the board. For example, In the Kubernetes world, one of the things that you can do with OPA is you can set policies to say that I only want to be my admins or to only want to launch Docker images from a certain repository. So OPA is a flexible policy agent, which is applicable across the board, and also allows things like attributes-based access control. So the flexibility of OPA is the primary benefit of OPA.
Those are the questions we have received so far from the audience, but we still have some time here. So Adit and I can hang on the line, and people who have additional questions, feel free to submit either through the Q&A box located on the Zoom webinar panel, or you can message me directly. We'll stay on for a couple more minutes.